Donald Trump is still actively fostering doubts about what might have happened to missing Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul.
Go ahead.
Have you asked for this audio, video intelligence that the Turks supposed
We have asked for it if it exists. We have asked for it. Yeah.
But you haven't got
We've asked for it if it exists.
Are you surprised that they haven't turned it over?
No, I'm not sure yet that it exists. Probably does, possibly does. I'll have a full report on that from Mike when he comes back.
Mike would be Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who just landed back in the U.S. after a seemingly chummy visit with Saudi officials in Riyadh. So what did he learn in Saudi Arabia so he can present a full report to President Trump?
Did they say that Mr. Khashoggi is alive or dead?
I don't want to talk about any of the facts. They didn't want to either, in that they want to have the opportunity to complete this investigation in a thorough way.
Here to talk about the president's response to what's happening in Saudi Arabia is John Brennan, former director of the CIA and an NBC News senior national security intelligence analyst. Good to have you here.
Hi, Chris.
So here's one question to start with. The Turkish intelligence services do seem to have a lot of evidence on what happened inside their consulate. Do you think they're bluffing, or do you think they actually have it?
Well, it sounds like some of the details that are being provided to the press, that someone has this intelligence that's finding its way out. The fact that this consulate is in Turkey, I think, indicates that the Turks might have been able to acquire some information, some intelligence about what transpired at the consulate when Khashoggi was there.
Because they're surveilling it?
Well, that's a good question, and I think...
I mean, isn't that the logical conclusion?
Well, that they would be able to acquire this information somehow. Whether or not the Turks themselves are doing it, other people are doing it, I don't know. And I don't want to speculate, but clearly something's coming out of that consulate.
Here's my question. Would you be confident that as this question emanates about who did this, that U.S. intelligence has a pretty good read on the situation?
I think that the U.S. intelligence has a pretty good read on the situation now from a variety of sources, and not just the media and the press in terms of what's coming out, but interacting with their Turkish counterparts as well as with other liaison services that might have some insight here, talking to some of their Saudi counterparts, and the various means of collection, whether it be technical or otherwise.
I mean, I guess my point is, if the president wants to know what happened, like, he could go call King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, or he could go to the U.S. intelligence services, whose job it is to find out information and hear what they have to say.
Well, it's about 2 weeks since Khashoggi went into that consulate, and over the past 2 weeks, I would suspect that CIA and its sister agencies in the intelligence community have been collecting information, processing it, analyzing it, and providing that information to the National Security Advisor and to Mr. Trump and others. So they're not going to wait until this investigation that the Saudis say is underway is completed. They're going to be providing them regular updates. And when I was at CIA as well as with the White House, there was constant interaction on issues such as this that have true implications for U.S. national security.
So the U.S. has worked closely with the Saudis for years, right?
Yes.
And there's been collaboration between their intelligence services.
With them, yes, especially on the counterterrorism front.
Yes. Is this the kind of thing they're doing all the time?
No, no.
Really? I mean, there's some sense in which it feels like this was just a splashier, grislier, uglier, more in-your-face version of a thing maybe they've been doing a lot.
Well, if you look back in Saudi's history, I think there have been chapters when the Saudi intelligence security services did engage in these types of violent, extrajudicial types of activities against Saudis as well as non-Saudis. My interactions with the Saudis during the last 10 or 15 years is that we were working very close with the Saudis and tried to professionalize them, making sure they understood that their obligations are to ensuring that they maintain the security and stability of the kingdom, but do it in a manner that's not going to be inconsistent with the norms that intelligence and security services need to follow. I'm not saying that the Saudis, did not engage in some things that we would find awful during the past 15, 20 years. But I know that under the previous heads of the services, such as the former Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, we worked very closely with him, and I would never, ever expect something like this, especially something as horrific as this, to take place under his watch.
Do you think this is a screw-up or this is intentional?
I think it's both. I think it was an intentional operation that was directed by Mohammed bin Salman because he has such a overarching control over all intelligence and security matters in Saudi Arabia and all of the services there. And something like this, as audacious as it was to carry out this action against a U.S. resident journalist for the Washington Post in a Saudi diplomatic mission abroad, would have required the highest level of approval in the Saudi government. And today, basically, that is Mohammed bin Salman. The way it was carried out, though, in such a, again, horrific manner and awful, it was very ham-handed. It was, how did they ever expect to get away with this? I scratch my head. I don't know how.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of the Skripal chemical weapons deployment by the Russians, in which it seemed to me the point of that was to send a message. I mean, they did it in a way where it's obviously them and they're selling to everyone else. We can find you too. Like, I wonder if that's the point here.
Well, I think that certainly was the Russian intention when they poisoned, or they tried to poison, the former Russian defector, Skripal, in the United Kingdom. And I think there was some plausible deniability there, the Russians.
Right, exactly. But it was a wink, wink, nod, nod. Like, we know the Russians did it.
Right, but you didn't have all of the evidence that has piled up. And if Khashoggi disappeared from a hotel in Turkey or a private residence or something off the street, then I think there'd be questions about what happened, who were these people. But in the consulate with these two airplanes that came from Saudi Arabia, royal airplanes that landed, and individuals who entered Turkey on diplomatic passports and that were, in fact, associated with Mohammed bin Salman, it doesn't seem like they tried to cover their tracks. And that's what's just so confounding about this whole thing. That they thought that they could get away with this. That Mohammed bin Salman thought that they could do this, and I think he was, he's very brazen, obviously, and I think increasingly reckless because he has this control. But it shows just how angry he was at Khashoggi. And he probably was trying to silence him, and maybe he thought he was going to be able to send a signal to others. But the way this has now evolved, it's a major crisis for U.S.-Saudi relations and for the Saudi government.
It also seems now we're in this surreal and to me kind of morally horrific situation in which the White House and the Saudis seem to be trying to sort of figure out what story they can come up with that they can both have plausible deniability for Mohammed bin Salman.
Yes, and their challenge is that they don't know the full extent of what the U.S. intelligence agencies and the Turks know. So I'm sure that they've been working to try to concoct a story that's going to stand up to the scrutiny that will be immediately put on it. And so how can they claim, then, that Mohammed bin Salman had no responsibility whatsoever? And is he looking for the scapegoats inside of Saudi Arabia? Is he already taken action against them to silence them? Even if he does that, though, if U.S. intelligence has damning information about his role or his authorization, then his story is just going to fall apart. And that's why it's so important for the intelligence agencies and CIA to fully brief the intelligence committees on the Hill so that they have full insight into what happened there, and they can then hold the administration's feet to the fire. And I really believe that this is where Congress is going to be so important, because if Mr. Trump and others try, in fact, to gloss over this somehow, I don't believe that the Congress, even people like Lindsey Graham, who's been so supportive of the administration, has come out with, fire and fury against this.
I should say that Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, who chairs the Foreign Relations Committee, just said that he has been denied briefings, that the White House is trying to close down information, and he's angry about that. So I think that we're going to see more fight on Capitol Hill.
I think the Senate Intelligence Committee, under Richard Burr of North Carolina and Mark Warner of Virginia, they have, I think, good credibility, and they work in a bipartisan fashion. And they should be demanding that CIA officers come down there and explain exactly everything that we know and what our assessment is.
All right, John Brennan, thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.